Hey guys, we're back again in our series After Eden, and we're looking at the second and almost final part of the story of Noah. Next week we'll have just a little bit left, and we'll wrap it up. So last week, if you remember, Noah, this chosen guy, this special guy that was righteous among this world of evil people, listened to God. He got included in God's plan because of his obedience, because of his ability to hear what God has to say, and even if he had questions, follow in what God's plan was. And because of that, he and his family and all of the animals of the earth were saved from this coming flood of God's judgment on sin and wickedness. So last week, our big idea is that when we are obedient, we get included in God's plan, and that benefits you and me. When we're obedient, we get a chance to be included in God's plan. This week, we have a new big idea, and I'm just going to give it to you out front, so that as we read this, you can sort of think about it. Our obedience that includes us in God's plan, blesses other people. Our being faithful to what God has for us, what God has planned for the whole world, actually is contagious. In the same way that sin is contagious, and the more we sin, and the sin in our lives, and the sin in the lives of the people around us, hurt us and actually make sin grow, obedience and faithfulness to God is contagious and actually brings good things and blessings to the world around us. And we see this in the story of Noah today. Noah's obedience is going to result in blessing for the world. And there's some cool promises, some cool things that God does in response to Noah's obedience that you and I should be super excited about today. And we see how the obedience of Noah, this one guy who follows God in all these small ways in building an ark, actually points to the ultimate obedience of Jesus, who even though he is God, dies because God the Father wills it for our sins, and how his ultimate obedience creates the ultimate blessing for you and me. So let's get into it. The story of Noah. If you remember, Noah built the ark, got all the animals on. In the middle of the flood, things are crashing. We say, geez, it's a good thing that Noah was obedient because what God has said has shown up, and Noah's obedience has saved him. All right, now that we're there, we start to read. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and all the domestic animals that were with him on the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided, and the fountains of the deep and the windows of the heaven were closed, and the rain from the heaven was restrained, and the waters gradually receded from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. In 7 months, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. And the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains appeared. So God, being faithful to his obedient servant Noah, remembers him. He cares about him. He thinks, man, I got to make sure I watch out for Noah. And he starts to bring back this flood of judgment. Then Noah, when he gets out of the ark, built an altar to the Lord. And he took every clean animal of every clean bird, and he offered a burnt offering on the altar. And when the Lord smelled it, he was pleased. And the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind. For the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done, as long as the earth endures, in seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, they shall not cease. So Noah's obedience and his faithfulness and his praise and his worship to God causes God to say, you know what? Even in the midst of all this wickedness, Noah was faithful, and because of this, I am never going to do this form of judgment again. I'm never ever going to wipe everything out again. He says, because of Noah's sacrifice and his pleasing obedience and giving to me, I've made up my mind that until the earth passes away, I'm never going to do this sort of thing again. So God blesses Noah and his sons, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth, on every bird of the air, on everything that creeps on the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Everything that lives shall be food for you. And just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood in it. For your own lifeblood, for the lifeblood of people, I will require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it from human beings. Each one for the blood of another I will require a reckoning for human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind. And you be fruitful and multiply, abound on the earth and multiply in it. God says to Noah, and that was a big passage, but I'm going to sum it up for you. God says to Noah, you, Noah, are the second Adam. Your family is the second first family, if that makes sense. You are the second first family, and in you, I am reestablishing the human race. And he says, but there are some things that are different now. There are some things that are broken here. And one of the ways that we can see that is that you guys have entered into a world where violence and sin and brokenness is just stuck here. And so you are killing and eating these animals around you. But he says, I want you to be clear that blood has a price. And he says, and particularly human blood has a price. He says, and there isn't going to be anyone who's going to be allowed to spill a human's blood without consequence. Because you need to remember that human beings were created special with my image in them. And because of this, he says, life matters, Noah. And I need you to get that across to your kids. And I want you to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and follow me. I want you to choose to follow me. But I know that there are going to be those, like he said earlier, whose hearts are dark and full of evil. I know there's going to be like those who are before the flood, but I've promised to see this through because of your faithfulness. I'm going to bless your descendants even if they don't deserve it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, he says, as for me, I'm establishing a covenant. That a covenant means a promise to your kids and those kids after you with every living creature. So Noah is getting a promise that's going to be applied to all of his kids and every single living creature on the earth because of what he did. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood that destroys the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. And get this, because sometimes you might know this story in your head and you're like, okay, I know what happens next. So God says, oh, I'm going to make a rainbow. That's not what God says. God says something really specific. God says, I am going to hang up my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring the clouds of the earth, my bow will be seen in the clouds, and I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it, and you'll see it, and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature that's on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that's on the earth. God says to Noah, Noah, I want you to get this. Because of your faithfulness, because of you listening to me, and because of what I set up here, and I'm making you into the second first family, that I'm telling, hey, there's going to be a different way that things operate around here. There's going to be some standards that you're going to have to live up to in this sinful and broken world, but I'm going to make an unconditional promise. He says, you see this war bow? That's what he says. He says, you see my bow that I use to hunt and kill things? He says, I'm going to hang it up in the clouds. And he says, and I'm not going to use it against you anymore. He says, you know this bow that is used for death? Like when I killed all those people in the flood, he says, I'm going to hang that up in the clouds, and I'm not going to use that against you anymore. I'm not going to flood the earth again. And every time you see my bow in the clouds, you're going to know it's not in my hand. I go, wow. Thanks, God. I appreciate that. He says, even if your descendants are wicked, I'm not going to wipe them out. I've got a better plan. And if we remember that there's a descendant that's coming that we thought might be Noah, who's going to reverse the effect of sin. And we're going to read more about the effect of sin and if it's reversed in Noah next week. But you and I know that Jesus is ultimately that descendant. That he comes down through the line of Noah, through the line of Adam, through the line of all these faithful people who have said yes and been obedient to God. And that he is the one who ultimately reverses the effects of sin and death, and keeps us together with God. Instead of God hanging up his bow and saying, you know what, I'm not going to kill you, in Jesus, we get to be God's son and daughters, the ones that are going to inherit his kingdom. What a difference that is. So what Noah does a little bit in his obedience to God and saying, yeah, God, I'm going to listen to you. Yeah, God, I'm going to build this ark. Yeah, God, I'm going to sacrifice these animals to you. Jesus says, yeah, God, I'm going to go to earth. Yeah, God, I'm going to become a human. Yeah, God, I'm going to be mocked and spit on and reviled and live a life of poverty and show them your love, but be killed on a cross anyways. And you see how much greater Jesus' sacrifice is, how much greater his obedience is. So where Noah gets this promise from God that God is no longer going to go to war again with the whole earth and the animals and everything, through Jesus, the whole earth is redeemed. And Jesus becomes the king over all creation. And we get the promise that through Jesus, you and I can not only not go to war with God, but be made right with him once and for all. And that our sin can be removed and forgiven. And that is the awesome story of what's happening here in this first few chapters of the Bible. We can look forward all the way to the New Testament, right? Like all the way, like all of this in between here. But even back here, God remembers and he knows that Noah is doing this little thing that Jesus is going to complete. And you and I are called to be like Noah and follow in the example ultimately of Jesus. And in obedience to God and sacrificing those little things in our lives, and sometimes those big things in our lives, we get to follow God and be part of his plan. And in doing so, we bring blessing, not only to ourselves, but to everything around us. And that's an awesome and beautiful calling. And we know that in the end, it's worth it and that God will reward it generously. Okay, hey, I hope you guys are having a really good week. Next week, I'm going to be gone down to Elkhorn for camp, so I'm not going to be posting one of these. So next week's an off week. I hope you all have a good time. You know, it's summertime, and I hope you're all out enjoying yourself. Fridays at 7:30, we have the online meetings, and I'd love to hear from you, love to see you, love if you guys send in questions, Bible questions, personal questions, anything at all. All right, see you. Hope you guys are having a good week. Bye-bye.